Hello, and welcome to Straight Talk 2020, Voting in America. During tonight's program, we invite you to participate by submitting your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Towards the end of the program, Furman students Caroline Ring and Ingrid Ramos will ask our speakers your questions. Also, Furman students who are seeking CLP credit, please be sure to participate in any polls later in the program. Now, please hear these words of welcome from Dr. Don Gordon.
Good evening. I'm Don Gordon, the Executive Director of the Riley Institute, and welcome to Straight Talk 2020, Voting in America, brought to you by Furman University's Riley Institute and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in partnership with South Carolina Educational Television. This three-part series will focus on the long and bumpy road that we travel to get to equitable, safe, and free elections, and the challenges we still face in making voting fair and accessible to all of our citizens, and the threats to election integrity made even worse this year by the pandemic and by political rhetoric and gamesmanship that are causing Americans to lose faith in the democracy on which we so rely. So to moderate tonight's program, we're delighted to have with us the legendary Beryl Dakers, a South Carolina broadcast pioneer. Beryl is leading SETV's commemoration of the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote, though women of color were unable to exercise their right to vote for decades after. In just a few moments, Beryl will talk with Michael Waldman, author of The Fight to Vote, about the history of voting and voting rights in America. And then professors of political science Cheryl Laird and Kelly Dittmar will join them to discuss voting behaviors today by these groups that were formerly disenfranchised. We're in for a rich, varied, and enlightening discussion. But before Beryl starts, please hear these words of welcome from the Riley Institute's Chief Inspiration Officer, former U.S. Secretary of Education, two-term Governor of South Carolina, Dick Riley. Secretary?
Thank you so much, Don, and good evening to everyone. I'm so pleased that you have joined us this evening virtually to participate in a very important conversation around the topic voting in America. I hope tonight's program and the ones that follow in this series will help all of us get a better understanding of our shared history, the real challenges we face in having safe, accessible voting, especially during this time of the pandemic. All of this is very important to preserve the integrity of our elections. We begin our series tonight with a look at the history of voting. I'm delighted that we have with us my good friend Michael Waldman, who is a person I have great respect for. Michael is an expert on a lot of things, but especially on the presidency and American democracy. Since 2005, he has led the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. That's very similar, by the way, to the Riley Institute. It's not the same thing, obviously, but it does very similar type work. It's really a nonpartisan law and policy institute that focuses on improving systems of democracy and justice there at NYU. Now, proud of that, Michael and I had the privilege to serve together for nearly the entire 8 years of the Clinton administration. As President Clinton's director of speech writing, I might add that that's no easy task. Bill Clinton was a very creative speaker. He really did a lot of his decision-making, preparing speeches. He had all those times with Michael. He was responsible for 2 excellent inaugural addresses and 4 State of the Union addresses, as well as some 2,000 other speeches prepared by the president. He is a wonderful speechwriter that has certainly an international reputation. But through his books, other writings, media appearances, Michael continues to share his vast knowledge, his wisdom, really for building an even better American democracy. That is his subject. My special thanks to you, Michael, for being with us tonight, sharing your expertise with us. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. Beryl Dakers is here to host this conversation. Beryl is a longtime friend of mine and another person that I have enormous respect for. She's really a giant among South Carolina broadcast journalists. So we're so pleased to have the two of them in this conversation. We have literally hundreds of people throughout the community who are listening tonight. I applaud you for seeking to enhance your understanding of how our democracy works and how we can improve our system of voting in America. To my friends in the OLLI program, and I'm a great supporter of OLLI, wonderful partners with Riley Institute, thank you for continuing your lifelong learning through this Straight Talk series. It's very important, a very popular series. And to all the students who are listening, you really inspire me. You make what this is all about important. You're the ones who carry our democracy forward into our future. It's really up to you to be informed in a very complicated era, to separate fact from fiction, and to defend the rights of citizens to be heard. Beryl and Michael, I now turn the program over to you, and I look forward to learning from you as I listen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Riley. It is always a joy to work with you. And thanks also to all of you who are joining us for this, the first of 3 installments on a very important topic. Before we begin our discussion, however, I'd like to encourage you, those of you who are tuning in, to participate by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions to Michael Waldman, Cheryl Laird, or Kelly Dittmar. And as time allows, those 2 students from Furman will ask our speakers to respond live to questions selected from your submissions. Right now, however, I'd like to welcome Michael Waldman, who is joining us from New York City. Michael, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure and a tremendous honor to hear from Secretary, as I knew him, Riley, Governor Riley. It was such a privilege to get the chance to work with him and to see how he brought dignity and values and high competence to his role as Secretary of Education. And it was not a surprise when Time magazine listed him as one of the best cabinet secretaries of the 20th century. I was very lucky to get to work with him.
Absolutely. Michael, in 2016, you wrote a book called The Fight to Vote, and it's truly an amazing historical review. Many people today take the right to vote for granted, but for many others, it has certainly been a long, hard-fought battle to achieve. If we begin tonight by going back to the founding of our country, what was the understanding then? What did the Constitution say about who gets to vote?
Well, you're right that the right to vote is at the heart of our democracy. It's at the heart of what it means, I think, to be an American, but that we've been fighting about it and who has access to it and what it means for well over 2 centuries. When you go back to the beginning of the country, only white men who owned property were allowed to vote. It wasn't anything like what we would consider a real democracy back then. Interestingly, the Constitution didn't say anything about who could vote. They left that up to the 13 states, which were considered at the time kind of sovereign countries. My book starts out, though, with Thomas Jefferson sitting at his desk in Philadelphia and writing the preamble to the Declaration of Independence and saying, in what was really important to them at the time, this passage, that government is legitimate only if it rests on the, quote, consent of the governed. That was a pretty radical idea in a world of kings. Now, we all know, of course, Jefferson was an utter hypocrite. At that moment, he was being attended to by a 14-year-old enslaved boy, as he wrote it. But the idea of equality and democracy was so powerful that it began to take on a life of its own, even at the very beginning of the country's history. And when they declared independence in 1776, each of these states had to write their own constitution. And in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, that was the most radical constitution. It was written by Benjamin Franklin, and they actually basically eliminated the property requirement. So poor men and working class men could vote. Franklin was asked to justify that, and he said, there's a man who owns a jackass, and it's worth $50, so the man can vote. But then the jackass dies, so the man can no longer vote. He's older, he's wiser, but he no longer can vote. So then who really has the right to vote, the man or the jackass? One more reason to love Ben Franklin. Well, up in Massachusetts, John Adams was writing their constitution. And people urged him, hey, why don't you do the same thing Ben Franklin did? Why don't you end that property requirement? And here's what John Adams said. He said, if we do that, women will demand the right to vote. Lads of 18 will demand the right to vote. Men who have not a farthing to their name will think themselves worthy of an equal voice in government, and they will demand the right to vote. John Adams said, there will be no end of it. And that's basically the history of the country right there. From that very beginning, with a very limited franchise for only white men who owned property, we fought and fought and fought to expand the circle of democracy so that it ultimately truly included every eligible citizen, all the way up to now. But we're still fighting about it, and people are still trying to make it harder for other people to vote at every step of the way. And it's still one of those things that we're debating.
It's amazing that that far back it foreshadowed what we would be talking about today. I'm curious, though, as to when the recognition of the power of the vote became a common thought. When did it become this most precious, sought-after commodity? And was it the magic elixir we all thought it would be?
Well, those are great questions. I think that it pretty quickly became the American thing. And interestingly, the very first great expansion of voting rights came in the United States in the 1820s and 1830s, when people all over the country fought to get rid of that property requirement. And ironically, if you want to say, given the current political alignment, the very first voting rights victory was won by angry white working class men in what was called the age of Andrew Jackson, Jacksonian democracy. They got rid of this, they got rid of the property requirement, and people understood the power of the vote. That's one of the reasons they tried to restrict it. They understood it as a basic element of citizenship. And we fought over it then. And then, of course, during and after the Civil War, it was won by African-American men. And people, again, really understood how important that was. In the book, I tell the story, Abraham Lincoln did not start out as a supporter of voting rights for Black men. But the war changed him, as in so many other ways. By the end of the war, there were hundreds of thousands of Black men serving in the Union Army. When the war was over, the Civil War was over, Lincoln gave a speech where he laid out his plans for Reconstruction. And in the speech from the second floor window of the White House, he said, I had a plan for Louisiana and it didn't give vote to Black men. He said, I've been criticized for that, and I now think the critics are right. I support giving voting rights to Black men under certain circumstances. And there was one member of the audience at this speech who understood this power and significance of what Lincoln said. John Wilkes Booth was there, and he gasped and turned to the man next to him, and he said, that means citizenship. That is the last speech he will ever give. And he actually tried to get the guy to shoot Lincoln on the spot. And when that man refused, he said, well, then by God, I will put him through. And of course, 2 days later, went to Ford's Theater. The right to vote was so powerful, it was actually a catalyst, a spark for that terrible act of the assassination. So people understood it in a very gut way, how important and powerful it was.
Well, certainly, as we look at the 15th Amendment, and we see all of it didn't quite do the job as far as being as inclusive as it could have been, but it certainly engendered people to rise up against it, that extending that right. So as we look at the historical precedents for voter suppression, and there are many, are there particular periods or eras that we really need to focus on?
Well, you're right in pointing to the 15th Amendment, which was gave the right to vote to Black men. And interestingly and importantly, both the 14th and 15th Amendment pretty clearly, explicitly cut out women, which was controversial even then. And we often forget, for a long time we forgot, and really it was kind of covered up, the true story of the 15th Amendment and what happened afterwards. In the period after the 15th Amendment was enacted, there was a flowering of democracy across the former Confederacy, including South Carolina.
So interesting that you would use that term, flowering of democracy, to describe Reconstruction. That's not at all what we learn in our civics lesson.
Right. There was, after it was over, and there was the reclaiming by the Ku Klux Klan and other white terrorist groups of the rights that had been won by Black men. There was basically a lot of effort to rewrite history. A lot of the statues that have gone up that are so controversial now were not from the time, but were from a later period when people were trying to say, oh, Reconstruction was terrible. Well, Reconstruction had its flaws, of course, but you had 90% voter turnout among Black voters. There were Black men elected governor and senator and to Congress and the state legislatures. And there was a real vision of potentially of a multiracial democracy. And then it was taken away. And what the lesson for us now is not that things have gotten that bad. I mean, literally, the right to vote was taken away from millions of people. But that history does not only move in one straight line. It's not all just kind of progress in one direction. There was progress, and then there was a reaction to that progress. And that is a dynamic that we've seen over and over again. And I think, in my view, in many ways, we're seeing aspects of that now as well.
You mentioned to me when we talked earlier that we look at two eras, Reconstruction and its end, where voting rights for Blacks were rescinded. And then the second Reconstruction, I guess, would be the Civil Rights era and its end, which brought us the Voting Rights Act. What did the Voting Rights Act actually do?
Well, and I apologize to the viewers. I'm noticing that the lights are going in and out on my screen, but I got doing my best with all the different little pandemic era doodads that I'm hoping will work. So you're right that historians and lawyers call it the second Reconstruction. And the Voting Rights Act, the same disenfranchisement of Black people in the South that we saw in 1905 was still basically the case in 1960. And the Voting Rights Act was the product of tremendous courage and great organizing skill by the civil rights movement. We all know, because we've all been reminded by his passing recently, that John Lewis, as a very young man, led the marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. And when they were set upon by law enforcement and beaten on national television for the very nonviolent act of trying to secure their rights as American citizens, public outrage, and television helped a lot, was so strong that it led President Lyndon Johnson to stand before Congress a week later, propose the Voting Rights Act, and say in his Texas accent, "We shall overcome." It was a very dramatic moment. What did the Voting Rights Act do? What it said was that states with a history of racial discrimination in voting when they wanted to have voting rules or voting laws that were changed, and it banned things like the grandfather clause and literacy tests. But when they wanted to make changes, they had to get approval in advance from the Justice Department or from a federal court in Washington. And there's this old saying that conscience is the idea that someone somewhere may be watching. Well, that conscience made a big difference. It was the most successful civil rights law, I think, in American history. It really changed how people voted, and it took away the fear. And voter participation rates by about 10 years ago for Black and white voters were around the same. What happened was in 2013, the United States Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in a case called Shelby County. And in the courtroom, Justice Scalia said, well, the Voting Rights Act, he said, it's nothing more than a racial entitlement. And everybody in the courtroom gasped. You can actually hear the tape. He didn't write the opinion, though. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the opinion. And what Roberts said basically was, well, that was then, this is now. Racism is a thing of the past. The South has changed, and it isn't needed anymore. And Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote a dissent. And this was a very famous dissent. And for those of you who follow her career, this was kind of the dissent that made her known to be the notorious RBG. It really was, it really struck home with a lot of people. She said, that is like standing in a rainstorm, holding an umbrella and not getting wet. So you throw away the umbrella because you're not wet. In effect, she was saying, making a prediction, as was Roberts, of what was going to happen. Well, what happened? Well, within hours, states began implementing harsh voting laws, cutting back on voting rights, making it harder for people to vote for the first time since the Jim Crow era, and affecting hundreds of thousands of people. And there's been a battle royale ever since in the courts and in state legislatures about this. But a lot of this is laid at the feet of the Supreme Court in Shelby County ruling.
Now, there are people who suggest that we may actually be in a third period or a third wave of Reconstruction now as a result of that, where there's a retaking of voting rights, if you will, or at the very least, a serious shifting is likely to take place. So how do you respond to that? Is it?
Well, I would say there's a big pushback. Why is there such a pushback? When I was in school, a lot of this stuff was in the history class. It wasn't in current events. It wasn't in political science. These were things that were seen as having basically been resolved. But over the last 20 years, and as I say, especially since this Supreme Court case, there's been a very focused effort to make it harder for some people in our country to vote. Some of it is a political strategy. Some of it is because of people manipulating the idea that there must be a lot of voter fraud. As a statistical matter, my organization, the Brennan Center, we've studied this, and you are more likely to be struck by lightning than to commit voter fraud in the United States. It is very rare. But I also think that the changing demographic nature of the country has something to do with it. We have a changing country. Black people and brown people are a larger and larger share of the electorate. And as has happened at other times of change, the kind of people with power, and in this case, that's the white majority, of which I'm a member, looks at this and says, gee, we better change the rules because we don't like the direction this is headed. It's a harsh thing to say, but I think it is really true. And we're seeing this play out this year. There were already lots of problems with voting, and it was going to be tough to see how our system was going to be able to handle all the people who wanted to vote. And of course, it's going to be much harder with the pandemic.
Is it fair to ask whether or not the social protests of today can find their direction and resolution in the existing institutions of government? Or is there the danger of a constitutional overhaul, or more specifically, the danger of having either the dissolution or the concentration of power in these institutions? In other words, have we worked ourselves into a corner where it's really gone too far?
Well, you're asking great questions. we have the oldest constitutional democracy, but that doesn't mean we have a perfect constitutional democracy. A lot of other countries did it later and kind of learned a lot of lessons from things we didn't get right. And we have a lot of ways in which our institutions of democracy, our institutions of self-government, are really eroded or broken, or serve values we don't think make sense. I mean, consider something like the Electoral College. We've now had twice in 16 years the person who won the presidential vote losing because of the Electoral College. It actually almost happened, that was in 2000, and in 2016, it actually almost happened in 2004, where Democrat John Kerry, if he got a few thousand more votes in Ohio, he would have been president even though George W. Bush won the popular vote handily. We've never had anything like that in our country's history, that kind of a period of where the counter keeps reading wrong what the people want. And you know what, one thing we're learning, or being reminded of, I guess, not learning, is that the vote is the center of democracy, but it is not the only thing. There are institutions, there are norms, there are values of the rule of law and respect for the opposition, checks and balances, and those kinds of things that are also very important. And we see so much partisanship right now and polarization. And again, the institutions of government are making those worse. And I'll mention, I know you've got another session on redistricting coming up later in the season. Folks may not know that has a special South Carolina flavor, because there's actually a provision in the Constitution called the Elections Clause. And James Madison was really determined to have it in there. And it says that states set the voting rules, but Congress can override them and pass national voting laws. And the reason James Madison said in the notes of the Constitutional Convention is because he wanted to make sure there wasn't going to be abuse of power and gerrymandering like in South Carolina, which was notorious at the time. And we have continued problems. They didn't just invent gerrymandering last year, but all across the country, such extreme partisan gerrymandering that the voice of the people very often is not reflected when they go to the polling place. It isn't reflected in the makeup of the legislature or the Congress that comes out of it.
You know, we have Native Americans, immigrants, young people, LGBTQ+, a variety of marginalized groups who are now demanding a greater say in government. So what kinds of issues do they provoke, and what challenges does that present for our elective system?
Well, going back to what good old John Adams said back in 1776, there will be no end of it. It is entirely in the great tradition of American politics and life that new groups or groups making new claims will say, we want to be represented, we want our seat at the table, and that kind of others are fighting them just as hard. You know, and it used to be in other eras, we're all familiar, or these days we're all familiar with the disenfranchisement of Black voters in the South after Reconstruction in the late 1800s. What a lot of people don't know is that something similar happened in the North to Catholics, to immigrants, basically, to people who were coming into the cities from Europe, and the existing power structure was horrified by that. And passed a whole bunch of laws there to make it harder for them to vote. And even in 1920, as you know, and many of our listeners probably know, this is a census year. I hope everybody has filled out the census. It really matters. One of the reasons it matters is it helps determine who has representation in government. And in 1920, which was the first time that cities had more people than the countryside, and again, it was Catholics and Jews and others from Europe who were not like the old American crowd, Congress reacted to that by deciding not to reapportion. They just threw out the census, and they said, oh, we don't have enough chairs in the House of Representatives to make this change. So these fights over representation, and representation in like a legislative sense, and representation in a sense of seeing yourself as you are, who you are, reflected in who has power. These are not new. The identities have changed of who is seeking their place at the table, but the fight has not changed nearly as much as we might hope.
It's almost as though you're saying we actually have a selective democracy. In just a moment, however, we're going to bring Drs. Laird and Dittmar into our discussion, but first we'd like to ask you, that's our audience members, to participate in a poll regarding who should be allowed to vote. Who should have the right to vote in America today? Michael, what do you think? I don't mean what do you think to the answers of the question.
Well, I would say that there's a pretty wide consensus. My main answer would be everybody who's eligible to vote should be able to vote. And there's a pretty wide consensus that any citizen should be able to vote. But even so, we have exceptions, and we make it harder for some citizens who are eligible, nevertheless, to vote. One of the main ways that that has been the case is what are called felony disenfranchisement laws. And those are laws that say that in one way or another, and there are a lot of different varieties of it, but that if you've committed a crime, that you lose your right to vote. You lose your right to vote while in prison, that's pretty widespread. But often afterwards, when people have returned to the community or paying taxes or part of public life, and there is very positive movement on a lot of these voting issues, which really do go beyond partisanship. The very worst felony disenfranchisement law in the country has been in Florida, another remnant of the Jim Crow era, but it said that if you had any kind of criminal conviction, that you were barred from voting for your entire lifetime. And that was 1.4 million people barred from voting. And if you think about what seemed pretty obvious to most of us, which is the racial disparities in the criminal justice system, that plays itself out in this disenfranchisement. Well, in 2018, the voters went to the polls and voted by overwhelming bipartisan margins to end that system of felony disenfranchisement, 64%. They restored the right to vote to 1.4 million people. That was nonpartisan, that was bipartisan. Unfortunately, the legislature didn't get the memo, and the Republican legislature and the Republican governor passed a law saying, well, yes, but you have to pay back any fees and fines that you might owe. And, you know, there's no bulletin board where you can even go find out what fees and fines you owed from some marijuana possession conviction from 30 years ago. Hundreds of thousands of people suddenly lost their right again to vote. And the Brennan Center, the organization I lead, and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and other groups, we've been going to court, and we keep winning, and the state keeps stalling and running out the clock. And so unfortunately, so many of those people who were given the right to vote back by their fellow Floridians will not be able to vote this November. So it should be citizens. Some people think it should be non-citizens, but I think there's really strong agreement that it should be citizens, but it really should be everybody who's eligible to vote.
Well, it will be interesting to see where our poll ends up. And it does seem to be a fact that once we get the right to vote and we claim it dearly, we're not that eager to share it with a lot of other people.
Or to use it. We have all these obstacles, and I work every day to fight the obstacles and bust down the obstacles, but far too few Americans vote. Voter turnout in 2014 was the lowest in 72 years. And yeah, some of that was due to anti-voting laws, but a lot more of it was due to people feeling disconnected and apathetic. Now, I will say that last time in 2018, it was the highest voter turnout in a century. So people have gotten reconnected, re-engaged, and fired up.
And we'll see what 2020 holds. Right now, however, Dr. Cheryl Laird is Assistant Professor of Government at Bowdoin College, and Dr. Kelly Dittmar is an Associate Professor at Rutgers University, Camden, as well as Director of Research at the Center for American Women in Politics at the Eagleton Institute. So I'd like to welcome you, ladies. And Cheryl, I think I'll start with you. You have a new book co-authored with Ishmael White entitled Steadfast Democrats, How Social Forces Shape Black Political Behavior. Now, Michael just touched on the 15th Amendment, Reconstruction, the ongoing battle for voting rights among Black Americans. So I'm curious as to how this history impacts Black American voting behavior today.
So it has a significant effect on Black voting behavior, right? Like just as was identified by Michael, these constrained access to the franchise have been very much defined by groups and who can gain access to the opportunity to vote. For African Americans, that has been very much defined within racial terms, right? So denying those rights, even after they've been granted with the 15th Amendment, you see imposing of and the creation of various types of policies and practice after Reconstruction and to suppress Black voter participation. And so as African Americans have been able to gain access to the prize, and we even see it in Reconstruction, they have recognized the constraints that they find themselves within the US system. And in recognizing that, they have understood as a smaller population of people in the United States, but wanting to have influence and impact on vote, that one of the best ways that they can do this is to vote as a collective. So if we find what is going to be important for the group interest, then that can be used as the basically the motivation, right, and the guidance for how the group should engage in politics. And so in Reconstruction, we see heavy support for African Americans for Republican candidates, and often those individuals that they were supporting were Black candidates who were getting their first opportunity to gain office in an electoral context. And we see that further on with the Democratic partisan loyalty that we see going on now since around the 1960s going forward in the Civil Rights period. So it's essential because that understood experience of being disenfranchised, one of the major driving forces behind why a collective behavior and a group-based behavior is what we see them do in their political engagement.
The Blacks are not a monolithic group. So while the evidence clearly shows the majority of Blacks do vote Democratic, and indeed there's an expectation that they will vote Democratic, can we assume that in these diverse and divisive times that will continue to be the case? And if so, why?
Yeah, no, I think you're raising excellent points. You know, individuals in the United States are incredibly politically diverse. I think people often make assumptions about them being a monolith because of the partisan behavior, but one needs to really think about how they understand their political worldview, how they're experiencing their politics, and that much of what they're trying to understand and engage with is, right, how do they get to spaces and communities that are going to improve for the group, right? So one of the concepts that's talked about heavily in the literature is this like a common fate or a linked fate, and that African Americans seem to express this strong belief that what happens to the group has an effect on them as an individual, right? So they're not necessarily thinking about politics only within this individualized type of understanding, but in fact, it's a lot by what is happening to the group. And so that's going to be a big thing that is going to be a part of that. But then also when it comes to partisanship, and what Ishmael and I talk about in the book, is what we think about is how do you see the maintenance of this partisanship over time, which would then say to us how to predict what African Americans might do in 2020. It's not that Black people are not politically diverse, that you don't have Black conservatives or Black liberals or Black moderates, Black evangelicals, Black agnostic atheists, but in fact what you have are people who are making a strategic decision to leverage their minority group numbers to have an influence on a politic that's majority based. So what we would expect then to see in 2020 is what we have seen before, that there is an understanding that the interest is that we are trying to do something that ensures that the Black voice is within the politic structure that is not really designed or created with them in mind. And then further, well, we are thinking about what as a group is going to be the party that's going to most embody that. And in the past, it's been the Republicans when they're around emancipation, and now it's become the Democratic Party in large part because of efforts for civil rights. And so African Americans have been very lockstep with their loyalty to the Democratic Party, but that's not some kind of decision that's being made with thought, right? I think it often is seen as terminologies like mental plantation, where they seem to not understand the politics. I would argue that African Americans are one of the most strategic, eligible groups of politics than any other group that we see in the United States because of the historical constraint. So for 2020, what we would expect is that, yes, there will be consistent partisanship of African Americans to the Democratic Party like we've seen before. And I think one of the key things the Democratic Party have to worry about is going to be voter mobilization in key states that ended up swinging the electoral college in favor of Donald Trump.
Kelly, this seems like a great point to bring you in, because women form a powerful and influential majority of the electorate. They outnumber men, they outvote men, but do women tend to utilize the block vote as do Black Americans?
Yeah. So we definitely see greater diversity in women's voting behavior when it comes to partisanship. So as Cheryl's noting, that sort of strategic approach of Black voters is not really true when it comes to women voters. Now, there have been plenty of cases where women voters are trying to leverage what we talk about as the gender gap, which is the gap in which women are more likely to align with the Democratic Party and vote for Democratic candidates than they are Republicans and then are men. And over time, you've seen women's organizations try to really make the case then to the Democratic Party that they need to be more responsive to women, but really that's a Democratic push, right? So it's still within party. The reality is, and what a lot of voters seem to learn for the first time in the last presidential election, is that women voters are actually very different, and there are plenty of Republican women voters, and race is a huge part of the story. So it was, as many learned in 2016, but it has been the case that white women, especially in recent years, have been more likely to support Republican candidates in the Republican Party than have been women of color, specifically Black women, who have been so strongly supportive of Democratic and so candidates and so integral in Democratic candidates' success. And so we have to be very careful when we talk about the women's vote or even the gender gap to be much more specific to the types of women we're talking about and where their loyalties have lied over the years. One of the things to watch for in this election, and I think why there's more attention to white women, whether right or wrong, is to note that there's been a shift among a particular group of women, white college-educated women, from Republican-leaning support to pretty strong and continued Democratic support in recent elections. And that's where I think we get a lot of the discussion now about, can that particular group play a swing role in this next election?
So what actually drives women to the polls then? Are you saying it would be because of women's issues, as well as the prospect of increasing the number of successful women candidates, or?
Yeah, so I think,
I
think the challenge is to say that there isn't one set of issues that mobilizes over 50% of the electorate, right? And so while there's been an attempt to say, and candidates I think have sometimes failed when they've done this. They've said, well, if I just talk about one or two women's issues, i.e., equal pay or paid leave, then I'm going to attract all of these women voters. When in reality, women's priority issues are very similar to men's. They want to make sure they can economically support their families. They're concerned about safety, security, as are many in the population, broadly speaking, perhaps not the type that the president right now is pushing, but broadly speaking, is their community safe? Do people have access to resources? And is their family safe and secure? When it comes to issues sometimes considered women's issues like abortion, for example, that's a push issue, but that's an issue for particularly conservative pro-life voters, not any more for women than for men. The one area where I think you do see some gender differences on policy in an election is to look at what mobilizes and motivates women to just get engaged in the first place. And so that dearth of representation of both issues that matter specifically to them and representation on the ticket can inform whether or not women are just enthusiastic about coming out and either supporting a candidate or party or even voting in the first place. So it speaks to Cheryl's point about just mobilization being really important, more so than deciding who they're going to vote for or which party they're going to vote for.
Oh, that's interesting. And Michael, we do want you to get back in the conversation as well. What then does the presence of having Kamala Harris on the Democratic ticket mean for this year when it comes to women voters and Black women voters?
Cheryl, do you want to take this first?
It's significant, right? Like, I think the call at the time after the primary elections was, or even kind of ending, the call was from many of the loyalist members of the Democratic base, which is Black women, that they wanted to see someone on the ticket that was representative of them. And I think that speaks to a long history, right, where Americans have been very consistently loyal to the Democratic Party. In a lot of cases, they cannot lose elections without that block of people voting in their support. And so that representation did matter to this group. And I think that was responded to well by Harris being put onto the ticket, because it is acknowledging, right, that this representation really matters. And I think that's frequently where women in politics are struggling. And I know Kelly, a lot of this as well, but a lot of times I think women in politics frequently find themselves not being seen, not being acknowledged, not being recognized from some of the efforts that they're putting forward. And in this case, you see an acknowledgement of that happening from the party. And I think that would be significant for mobilization as well.
One of the things that, organizations like Higher Heights, who are working to both empower Black women voters as well as candidates, have said repeatedly, and I just think that the terminology is right, is it's a return on investment. So Black women have been investing in the Democratic Party and not getting that return in terms of actual power in office, among office holders. There's still significant underrepresentation of Black women across levels of office, but it's most significant when you get to these executive levels. So not just at the presidency, where of course that persists, but also we've never elected a Black woman governor in this country. We have a handful of Black women who serve as statewide executives. There are 311 of those positions nationwide. Those numbers are especially not representative. And so I think that pressure, and we saw petitions, et cetera, to be sure to put a Black woman on the ticket was overdue, right? This was something that was well due to Black women in terms of what Cheryl was noting, in terms of the loyalty and work that Black women have done for the Democratic Party. So, I wrote a piece of the director of our center, where we said, don't celebrate the decision to nominate Kamala Harris, celebrate Kamala Harris in this moment in the history made, but Joe Biden was doing something that should have been done long before now, and he was doing something in a position of privilege. Part of the reason why he got this nomination, right, is because of the privilege he has as a white man. And so sort of noticing that contrast, I think, is also important in this historic moment.
As he himself said, I'm not going to face the sexist attacks that Hillary Clinton faced. Now, you can say he shouldn't have said that, but he was not wrong. And it is one of the things that's so striking about Senator Harris's choice for the ticket, and the way it recognizes the importance of Black women as both the voting bloc, but also the energy source for the Democratic Party. First off, of course, in South Carolina's voters have a lot to do with that, and a lot to do with the coalition that was assembled by Biden, sort of out of a time when he was in 4th or 5th place. Within days, the power of the Black vote, and Black women in particular, as a recognized part of the politics. In a way, what's striking is that Harris who is a woman and Black and South Asian, was seen as the safe choice, the most qualified choice, the obvious choice for this job. Is really a striking thing. It's an important thing to remember. When you have the sense that only white men or Protestant white men seem to run the show for many years, if Biden wins, he will only be the 2nd Catholic president of the United States. And he's only the 3rd, 4th time a Catholic has run as a major party nominee. In other words, it has been such a closed club, certainly for women. And I do think it's highly unlikely that the Democrats, given their coalition, will ever nominate a ticket of white men, just 2 white men again. And it may be the case that there's always a person of color on the ticket, and that would be reflecting the country and where it is, were that to be the case.
Well, I need to move along so that our students can ask some of your questions, but I would be remiss if I didn't say this. We have witnessed over the past several years the development and the strengthening of 2 very powerful and broadly encompassing movements. I'm talking about the Me Too movement, of course, and the Black Lives Matter movement. So just quickly, what impact might they have on the upcoming election?
So I think the significant what BLM particularly will have on the movement, because it is something that we are still seeing fairly advertised in the media and getting a lot of attention, as well as the protest and the civil disobedience that's going around it. So I think in the debates to come, both of the candidates and the incumbent president is going to have to what is going on. They're going to have to kind of give position on what they think is going to go forward in terms of how they will try to do it. I think President Trump has openly spoken about taking a more law and order approach and clamping down on sees as unrest that is unsuitable and problematic in his mind. I think Biden has to be very careful, because I think he has to openly acknowledge what is going to be an important issue to his base. But at the same time, right, he doesn't want to distance himself from individuals who may be looking at these protests in ways that they see, particularly like the riots or behaviors that are not seen as in line with just civil disobedience, broadly construed, that would be an endorsement on his part of them. So how do you condone that? How do you basically say that that's not acceptable, and also raise attention to this issues that are brought by BLM?
I think both movements have pointed out sort of the inequities within our institutions, and they've caused us all to ask a lot more questions, and I think put pressure on these institutions to change, which I think affects our elections. So now you see white male candidates being asked if being a white man is actually a problem, right? Like this is the first time, and you've seen the white male candidates for president not know how to respond to that. I can tell you that every woman candidate, every person of color who's run has been asked that question. Well, why is it important that you're a woman? Why is it important that you're Black? White men don't know how to respond to that because they're so accustomed, right, to that being the acceptable default. And so because we're starting to pay attention to those inequities, whether it be in areas of sexual harassment, whether it be race, these are power dynamics. And we're challenging them. So we're asking different questions. And that means the candidates, as Cheryl's noting, have to be ready to respond to those with some sort of an actual plan to address those structural inequities.
Today, I think we're going to see this really play out in the election, just as my colleagues have described. Today, President Trump, visiting Kenosha, Wisconsin, said he does not believe there is systemic racism in law enforcement. Joe Biden, who has been in office forever and ever and has a long history on criminal justice issues, has said emphatically in 2020 that he thinks there is systemic racism. And these issues will be the stuff that this election turns on. One of the interesting questions is, it was really striking in 2010, the Tea Party movement, quickly turn to running for office in the ballot box. And one of the questions is, will the energy on the streets now translate into votes? And we don't really know.
Interesting to speculate on. We are running so short on time, but I know our students would like to ask our speakers a few of the questions that you have submitted. So Caroline and Ingrid, are you there?
Hi, yes, I have the first question for you all. David asked, voting rights have become a partisan issue, which makes it harder to pass reform. How can these issues get bipartisan support?
It's true, these used to be much less partisan, and right now they are sharply partisan and polarized. It's also true, though, that the further away from Washington, D.C. one gets, often the less partisan they are. Let me give you an example. There's something that we at the Brennan Center have worked to develop called automatic voter registration. It's the idea that if you're eligible to vote, you should be on the rolls, and unless you choose not to be. And it would add 50 million people to the rolls permanently if it were fully implemented. It is now the law in 17 states, and making a big difference, and increasingly bipartisan, increasingly passing legislatures in Republican states as well as Democratic states, by big margins or unanimously. Now in Washington, they're fighting about it, and the House of Representatives passed automatic voter registration as well as restoring the Voting Rights Act and campaign finance reform in legislation called the For the People Act, H.R. 1. But Mitch McConnell and the Republicans in the Senate are not letting it come up for a vote. So there you're seeing the partisan divide. But I think there can be places where people come together.
Let's take another question.
All right, this question is directed for Dr. Laird. Kendra asks, given changes in the country's demographics, is it possible that white voters may give more emphasis to white identity while voting and start voting as a voting bloc?
If white voters will start voting as a voting bloc?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So this is something we actually talk about in the end of our book. So one of the ways we see some of the same norm behavior occurring, where we see people having expectations of how this behavior is supposed to be in the politics, and acting upon their political behavior in terms of their partisan loyalty, is actually from Southern whites. And there's been a long history, right, of affinity to particularly parties that have taken on positions that have been where a lot of Southern whites have positioned themselves on various issues, but a lot of it is around slaves, and that has been a very much of a driving force around that, and that has had much more spread beyond the Southern region, right? That the Republican Party, even of today, has taken on many of similar types of ideas or proposals or issues and use that as the national agenda, right? And in this light, for instance, something like law and order that we're seeing right now is being referenced by the president in Kenosha is something that has a long history of being utilized by parties to make particular appeals, especially racial appeals, to bases of supporters who will fall in line with that. And a lot of that is within the white population. Over time, though, we will see white identity politics is complicated because for a lot of white people, thinking of themselves as white, something that is their first thought, their life lived experiences, isn't defined necessarily by identity. But the more that we watch in the polarization that's going on, and the more that we see citizens, particularly I would say, especially from the Republican Party, utilizing that with more in a lot of their appeals, I think that there's something to be thought about with, how much more expansive we see that being, and to what degree will we see white individuals seeing the political world through the lens of white identity as those get more and more heightened.
I think you have just raised the specter for another discussion. Unfortunately, our time has flown. I'd like to take this opportunity, of course, to thank our wonderful panelists. You've certainly given us a lot of food for thought, and I know there are lots and lots of questions out there because I still have lots and lots of questions. On behalf of the Riley Institute and Ollie at Furman, and of course, South Carolina ETV, I'd like to say thank you all for joining us for this event. We do hope you'll be back next week for a look at voting rights, voter and election fraud. and fair redistricting. That session will be hosted by NPR's own Don Gagne with superstar voting rights attorney Allison Riggs. And they'll also be joined by two well-known members of the South Carolina House of Representatives, the Honorable Gilda Cobb-Hunter and the Honorable Gary Clary. You, of course, can register tonight to join them, or if you're smart and you've already registered, do be on the lookout for a Zoom link in your email in the coming days. Again, a very, very special thank you to all of us. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this, and thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.